So I'm Hayan Charara, and I'm the author of Something Sinister, my third book of poems.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us here for the ceremony. You're actually being recognized for two books this evening, Something Sinister, your poetry collection, but also The Three Lucies, a children's picture book. I wanted to start by asking about how the cats named Lucy really come up in both pieces, and in the poem Animals in your collection, and then also as characters in the picture book. And I was wondering if you could talk about really what inspired you to explore this concept and the July War in such different ways and for different audiences.
Sure. The name Lucy is tied to the dog that my wife and I rescued in New York City. It's a black lab that we found tied to a subway entrance, and she was pregnant. That part of the narrative is represented in the poem about the story. The poem is called Animals. And we rescued the animal, and my brother at the time, he's in high school now, but he was a 3-year-old. It was the first animal he had a real connection to. And when he finally had pets of his own, he actually named the first several of them Lucy. So he had several Lucys in the house. And so the idea for the name came from that, just a real story. And there's a beautiful kind of childhood innocence in it, right? To name all of your pets after the first one that you grew attached to. I didn't think of writing the story for the children's book until long after I actually wrote about the July War in a poem. And it was one of the first poems I'd written after I'd spent about a year where I didn't write much. There's no glamorous story behind it. I simply had quit smoking and just had a hard time writing. But the July War took place in 2006, and I was 6 months into my trying to quit smoking. And when I finally sat down to work on the poem, it was several months later, and it was at the time just a time-consuming event. And it was obviously anxiety-producing. I had family that lived in Lebanon, and my little brother was actually living there as well. And by then he was 6 years old, and so it was a daily calling to find out if they were okay, and worrying about them. And I held on to. I mean, it's the definition of trauma, right? It's something that happens to you and stays with you and recurs in some other way. And whether it's in poetry or whether someone is dealing with trauma in a clinical way or a historic way, there's a need to go back to it and to make sense of it, to grapple with the questions. And that's essentially what I was doing in the poem, to go back to that event and try to make sense of, primarily in the poem, I was trying to make sense of the helplessness. The war was, relatively speaking, short, but it was devastating, and it was difficult to get politicians. At the time, the politicians I tried to the politicians I tried to reach out to have them do something about the war, to step in some way or another. My congressmen and senators in Texas, is where I was living, were not interested. And many people I would talk to were also, not that they were disinterested, but they were indifferent almost to what was happening. And I had to figure out a way to reach them, and the way was not through people. And this is sad to say, but we become easily desensitized or distanced from the suffering of many people. But rather, I went through the way of animals, what happened to the dogs and the cats in this war. And that really touched a nerve and grabbed people's attention. And it's a few years later that I was urged to, once again, by one of my mentors, who's Naomi Shivnai, a poet and children's author. She'd been trying to get me to write a children's story for years. She first reached out in the early 90s and just wasn't ready to do it. And yet again, she came back to me. I was actually in San Antonio where she lives. We were having lunch, and she told me about this book award in this press that is focused on writers of color, stories by and for people of color, and suggested I give them something. And the only story that I really knew about a young person that wasn't the only story I knew, but the one that kept coming to mind was the story of my brother's experience in war. And I thought it would be a challenging project to pick up because it's not your typical subject for children's literature. But I knew that if I could handle it in a certain way, it might work. And that's how I got to writing the story. And then it took a few years for the revisions and the illustrations to work, but I think it was in the end worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. That kind of actually was my next question. I was curious about the process of creating a children's book and writing for young readers and working with an illustrator, being so different than what you usually do.
Right. Well, the writing of the story was relatively quick. I think I wrote the story in about a week or so. I should say I wrote the first draft in a week or so. We spent the next couple of years revising that. And it's a children's picture book, so it's on the long end of a children's picture book, but it's a couple thousand words long. It's not a very long book, but the publisher and the editors I worked with were meticulous and deliberate in their thinking. We sometimes spent several emails going back and forth, considering a single word and which way the word might be best understood, or whether or not another word might be better for what we were trying to convey to a young audience and how they would understand it. It was a really eye-opening process. It made me realize a couple of things, one of which is that I really wasn't a children's writer. There was some measure of luck involved, that I pulled off a story that might be appropriate for children, but it really was a new genre for me. And the second thing I realized is that it's far more difficult than I ever imagined it would be. And it's something I should have been aware of, because the same thing applies for poems. They may look accessible and they feel maybe that they were easily written, but of course that's not the case. The process with the illustrator, Sarah Khan, is such a beautiful painter, and what I knew for sure going into the process was that I had no skill or expertise whatsoever in illustrating. So when the publishers talked to me about that, I left it all up to them. I told them I didn't want to interfere in any way, and they had showed me some illustrations by Sarah. I thought they were gorgeous, and I trusted her years and years of experience as an artist, and she did such a great job of interpreting and adding to the story. And I was really pleased when I saw the book, and I've been able to actually communicate a good deal since the publication with Sarah. We've spoken on the phone, we've emailed, and her process was, I think, in many ways much more involved than mine. She traveled to Lebanon. She spent 2 to 3 years making the artwork. Each page of the book is a painting, and she made, in some cases, a few versions for each page. And they really bring out the the emotion that is found in the words, but which can be powerful. But I think she just added a deeper dimension to those experiences that a reader might have with the story.
Yeah, she'll be here tonight, and she sent me a link to a video that she just created.
I watched it, and
we're going to show it on
yes,
stage
I'm grateful.
tonight.
It's such a beautiful video,
Yeah.
and she also, what I really enjoyed about her illustrations, in addition to capturing what I think is the essence of the story, is that she was also able to add some layers to the story that may or may not have been there. I don't know. But Sarah is there's a kind of joy that runs underneath all the artwork that's present there. And for a story that is I think it's a sad story, but it's a hopeful one. But she brings some of that joy that might be deeply buried in the wording of it to the surface, and it's expressive in her personality, in the video that she makes.
Yeah.
She clearly is a fun person to be around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I noticed in the acknowledgments and at the beginning of Something Sinister that you thanked a number of Arab American authors, several of whom are previous Arab American Book Award winners.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could tell me about the community of Arab American writers that you interact with and how they've influenced your work.
The writers I first was drawn to were either Detroit-based or Detroit-associated writers, or else they were Arab American writers. So Philip Levine and Lawrence Joseph, for example, are two who I think of as my forebears. Philip Levine, of course, he died recently, but was from Detroit and is probably Detroit's most famous poet. Strangely or ironically or sadly enough, the city he was writing about, Detroit of the 40s, 50s, 60s, is in some ways not so different than the Detroit that I knew, and I'm sure is in some ways similar to the Detroit that people still know. Larry Joseph was the first, he and Naim Shibnai were the first Arab American poets I had been introduced to. And actually the person who introduced me to both of their work, if I remember right, is Debbie El-Najjar, who was another young Arab American writer I'd met. She was writing fiction at the time. I believe she was either a student or a TA at Wayne State University. And she introduced me to their work, and Larry and Naomi were also, they were probably my age. They were the age I am now, and they had come through Detroit, I think through Access, and they held workshops. This is at the Access Center in the South End when it was still in the South End, and I met them. I was, I think, 19 or 20 years old, and it was really wonderful. I think they knew I was serious about wanting to be a poet, and they were generous with their time, and we have since, with both of them, remained in touch. I communicate with them regularly, and every now and then get to see them as well. But a story that I hear a lot, even today, and actually just a couple of days ago, I met some young writers at the University of Michigan in Dearborn, and a couple of them pointed out that they have often felt that they were alone or one of the only young Arab poets or fiction writers doing what they're doing until they actually meet or come into this community that's actually quite large and thriving. And that was my experience also back in the mid-90s. I moved to New York and I met Suhair Hamad and Natalie Handel and Kazim Ali, and the list goes on. And in some of these cases we were actually neighbors. We lived in the same neighborhood, and we kind of grew up as poets together. And it was also in New York City that I met D.H. Malhem and Barbara Nimri Aziz and some of the other like elders of the writing community, and they were involved in RAWI, the Radius of Arab American Writers, and that opened up access to an even larger writing and artistic community. And and suddenly after a few short years I found myself becoming friends with and learning about dozens and dozens of poets who'd been doing what I wanted to do, but had been doing it long before me. People like Khalid Matawa and Elmaz Abenader, and just it's a large community, but we're still small enough to, I think, constitute a family that is the numbers aren't so big that you can't really know these people well. You can, and when we get together every couple years or so at a conference, it feels like a family reunion.